In 170 AD, the most powerful man in the world sat alone in a military tent on the frozen frontier of the Danube and wrote a note to himself that he never intended anyone to read. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing because he needed the words to survive the night. That man was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and the notes he left became the book we call the Meditations. What makes them extraordinary is that they were not philosophy lectures. They were daily exercises, a discipline he repeated because without it, he could not have endured what his life demanded of him. If you have ever felt the weight of responsibility crush your sense of peace, or watched your calm shatter the moment something went wrong, you are facing exactly what he faced. In this video we will examine the 5 Stoic principles Marcus Aurelius practiced every single day to govern an empire and himself. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. He was fighting plague, war, and betrayal when he wrote, in Meditations 2.1, that he would meet ungrateful and arrogant men that day, and prepared himself for it before dawn. That preparation was a method. And we begin with it now. Marcus began nearly every day with an act that seems almost pessimistic to modern ears, and yet it was the foundation of everything else. In Meditations 2.1 he writes that when he wakes he will tell himself he will meet the meddling, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful. He did this not to poison his mood but to remove the element of surprise, because the Stoics understood that most of our suffering comes not from events themselves but from being ambushed by them. When you expect difficulty, difficulty loses its sting. This is why the morning preparation, what the Stoics called the premeditatio malorum, was the first defense of the day. It worked precisely because it was rehearsal. Marcus was training his mind to encounter the worst of human behavior without being thrown by it, which meant that when betrayal or cruelty came, he had already absorbed the shock in advance. And yet there was a second half to this exercise that most people overlook. He did not stop at expecting the bad. He reminded himself that these difficult people shared his own nature, his own reason, his own kinship in the human community, and that he could not be harmed by them unless he allowed his own judgment to be corrupted. But this raises a harder question: if difficulty is inevitable, how does one keep it in proportion? The second principle Marcus practiced was a deliberate shift of perspective, an exercise the Stoics performed in the imagination to restore proportion to their fears. In Meditations 9.30 he instructs himself to look at human affairs from above, to see the crowds, the courts, the marriages, the wars, the markets, all of it, as if from a great height. From that vantage, the things that consume us up close shrink to their true size, because distance reveals what intensity conceals. This was not a denial of life's seriousness. It was a correction of scale. Marcus, who held more power than almost any human being alive, understood that power itself was fleeting, that the empires of the past had been swallowed by time, and that he too would be forgotten. In Meditations 4.3 he reminds himself that Alexander the Great and his stable boy were both reduced to the same dust. This is why the view from above functioned as a kind of medicine for anxiety, because anxiety thrives on the illusion that this moment, this problem, is everything. When you widen the frame, the crisis remains real but stops being total. And yet perspective alone is not enough, because a person can see clearly and still be paralyzed by what he cannot control. What Marcus practiced next addressed exactly that paralysis. The third and perhaps most central discipline Marcus practiced was the constant sorting of his experience into 2 categories: what was within his power and what was not. He inherited this directly from Epictetus, whose discourses he studied closely, and whose opening lesson was that some things are up to us and some are not. Within our power are our judgments, our intentions, our responses; outside it are our bodies, our reputations, the actions of others, the verdict of fortune. Marcus returned to this division again and again because it was the gateway to peace. In Meditations 6.8 he writes that the mind adapts and converts to its own purposes the obstacle to our acting, which means that the only territory he truly governed was the inner one. This is why he could lose a battle, bury a child, or face the betrayal of a trusted general, and still hold something inviolable within himself. The Stoics did not teach indifference to outcomes. They taught that you act with full commitment toward what you value, and then release your grip on the result, because the result was never yours to command. To grasp at what lies outside your control is to guarantee frustration, while to focus entirely on your own conduct is to claim the one freedom no one can take. But knowing this distinction intellectually is easy. Living it under pressure is where most people fail, and Marcus had a daily method to make it automatic. For the Stoics, the phrase living according to nature was not a poetic flourish but a precise instruction, and Marcus practiced it as a daily orientation. To live according to nature meant two things at once: to live in accordance with the rational order of the universe, and to live in accordance with one's own nature as a rational, social being. In Meditations 4.4 Marcus argues that because we share in reason, we share in a common law, and because we share a common law, we are fellow citizens of a single great community. This is why he could not separate his private virtue from his public duty. His role as emperor was not an interruption of his philosophy but its application, since for the Stoic, virtue is expressed precisely in how one fulfills one's station among other human beings. To live according to nature, then, was to do the work in front of you, honestly and well, because that work was your share in the rational order of things. He reminds himself in Meditations 8.5 to do each act of his life as if it were his last, free from frivolity and from the resentment that divides a person from his duty. What this reveals is that Stoicism was never an escape from the world into private serenity. It was a method for engaging the world without being deformed by it. And yet the world resists us constantly, which brings us to the principle Marcus is most famous for. The fourth principle Marcus practiced is captured in one of the most quoted lines of the Meditations, and it transformed his relationship with adversity entirely. In Meditations v.20 he writes that the impediment to action advances action, and what stands in the way becomes the way. This is a profound reversal of how most people experience difficulty, because we instinctively treat obstacles as interruptions to the life we wanted to be living. Marcus treated them as the very material of that life. The Stoic logic here is precise: since virtue consists in how we respond to circumstances, any circumstance whatsoever becomes an opportunity to practice virtue. An unjust accusation becomes the occasion for patience. A failure becomes the occasion for humility. A delay becomes the occasion for endurance. This means there is no situation, however hostile, that cannot be turned into fuel for the disciplined mind, which is why Marcus could face plague, rebellion, and grief without being broken by them. He did not pretend these things were good. He recognized that his response to them was the only thing that could be good or bad, and that response remained entirely his. What this gave him was a kind of invincibility that had nothing to do with control over events and everything to do with the inner conversion of every event into a test he could pass. But there was one final discipline that gathered all of these together at the close of each day. The fifth daily practice closed the loop the morning preparation opened, and it was the most demanding of all because it required honesty with oneself. Before sleep, the Stoics conducted a review of the day, a practice Seneca describes vividly in On Anger 3.36, where he recounts going over each day's actions and asking what fault he cured, what defect he resisted, in what way he became better. Marcus practiced his own version of this self-examination throughout the Meditations, which are themselves a record of a man auditing his own conduct. He asks repeatedly whether he acted justly, whether he let anger govern him, whether he wasted the hours given to him. This evening review was not self-punishment. It was calibration, because the Stoics believed that progress in virtue requires the same attention that progress in any craft requires. You cannot improve what you refuse to look at honestly. By examining the day without flattery and without excessive harshness, Marcus could correct his course before the faults hardened into habits. This is why the examination mattered so much. It converted philosophy from a set of ideas held in the head into a discipline lived in the body of one's actions. And yet even this discipline pointed toward something larger than self-improvement, it pointed toward the one truth Marcus never let himself forget. Underneath all 5 practices ran a single recurring meditation that gave them their urgency, and it was the contemplation of death. Marcus returned to mortality on nearly every page, not from morbidity but from clarity, because the awareness of death is what gives each action its weight. In Meditations 2.11 he tells himself to do, say, and think as a man who might leave life this very moment, and in Meditations 4.17 he warns himself not to live as if he had endless years ahead. This is the ancient practice of memento mori, the remembrance of death, and far from depressing him, it concentrated him. When you genuinely accept that your time is limited and uncertain, trivial grievances lose their grip, petty ambitions reveal their emptiness, and the question of how to spend this hour becomes serious. Marcus used mortality the way a craftsman uses a deadline. It forced him to stop postponing the work of becoming the person he intended to be. This is why the Stoics, often accused of being cold, were in fact among the most intensely present thinkers in the ancient world, because nothing makes the present moment vivid like the knowledge that it will not last. The fear of quietly wasting one's life dissolves only when one stops treating life as inexhaustible. And this brings us to how all 5 of these principles work together in practice. What becomes clear when you study the Meditations closely is that these 5 practices were never isolated techniques but a single integrated discipline, each one supporting the others. The morning preparation set the day's expectations, the view from above kept those expectations in proportion, the dichotomy of control directed his energy only toward what was his, living according to nature gave that energy a worthy aim, the obstacle principle converted every setback into practice, and the evening examination measured the whole against the standard of a life well lived. Remove any one of them and the others weaken, because a man who prepares for difficulty but cannot convert it into virtue merely braces for suffering, while a man who sees the obstacle as the way but never examines himself loses the ability to correct his errors. Marcus understood that philosophy was not a doctrine to be admired but a regimen to be practiced, and in Meditations v.9 he urges himself not to be disgusted or discouraged if he fails to act perfectly from principle, but to return to it again and again. That phrase, return to it again, is the heart of the matter. Stoicism is not a state you achieve once. It is a practice you renew daily, knowing you will fall short, knowing the falling short is part of the practice. This is why these principles still work 2,000 years later, requiring no belief system and no special circumstances. They require only the willingness to begin again each morning. And that willingness leads directly to the most practical lesson of all. The most practically applicable truth in all of this is that Marcus Aurelius had no advantage you lack when it comes to the inner life. He had immense power, yes, but power did not protect him from grief, betrayal, exhaustion, or self-doubt. If anything it multiplied them. What sustained him was not his throne but his practice, and that practice is fully available to anyone willing to do it. You can begin tomorrow morning by anticipating, calmly and without bitterness, the frustrations the day will bring. You can pause at midday and widen your perspective when something feels overwhelming. You can sort your worries, throughout the day, into what you control and what you must release. You can do the work in front of you as your share in something larger than yourself, and treat every obstacle as the raw material of character. And at night, you can review the day honestly, asking where you fell short and resolving to begin again. None of this requires money, leisure, or belief in any particular doctrine, because Stoicism was always a method rather than a creed. In Meditations 7.59 Marcus writes that you must dig within, for within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if you will ever dig. That is the final instruction. The resources you need are not external and never were. They are inside you, waiting to be drawn upon by the discipline of daily return. The Meditations endure not because Marcus Aurelius was an emperor but because he was a man struggling, every day, to remain decent and clear under pressure that would have destroyed most people, and he left us the exact method he used. These 5 principles, the morning preparation, the view from above, the dichotomy of control, the obstacle that becomes the way, and the evening examination, were never theories. They were a regimen for a mind under siege, and the same regimen is available to you now. The practical truth is this: peace is not something you find once and keep, but something you practice and renew each day. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe and we will keep exploring why. And if you want to start your own Stoic practice, there is a free Stoic starter kit in the description, quotes, a daily routine, and a journal to get you started. Any books or resources I mentioned are linked there as well.